For today's topic, we're going to cover herbivory. Now, there's a couple reasons why I want to separate this out as a distinct interaction, and one of them is because I spent a lot of time working on plant defenses against herbivores. But I also want to discuss this concept because it's kind of an interesting one in that sometimes it's like predation, sometimes it's like parasitism. It really depends on the outcome. And then the last reason why I want to talk about it is because we typically think of the world from our perspective. And if you look at the screen so far, I mean, we've got all these images of sort of an idealized world. Beautiful green, lush golf courses, intact forests, rows and rows of corn. But that's not what the world typically looks like. And if it does look like that, it's because of a lot of inputs of herbicides and pesticides and things like that. Instead, if you don't have all those agricultural inputs, here's what you actually get. You get fields of crops devastated by insects that come in and eat all of those plants. You get ears of corn that are infested with corn earworm. You get leaves that are demolished by groups of caterpillars. You get tomato fruits that are attacked by insects that burrow in and eat the seeds in the fruit. Or you get these kind of channels here made by beetles as they develop underneath the bark of a tree. Herbivores are very, very common. Think of plants as this free food that's out there that's capturing energy and storing it in the form of fruit or plant tissue, and it's just free and available for the herbivores taking. So the ideal world might look like what we see on the left, but on the right is more of the reality. So herbivores tend to be a pretty important factor in shaping the traits of plants, and of course the whole rest of the food web depends on the production of plants. So this is kind of an important topic, and I wanted to pull it out in part for that reason. Now there's a huge diversity of different kinds of herbivores. Very few birds are herbivores, but there are some, like these geese. Lots and lots of big mammals, like these ungulates, elk, deer, cows, are herbivores. In fact, if I were to ask you for an herbivore and the plant that it eats, typically what people will say is a grass-eating cow. So grass-eating cows, classic herbivores. But lots of other things eat plants, and the only thing that and there's lots of other things that get eaten besides grass as well. If you think about under the water, there are a few fish, not very many, but there are a few fish that will graze on algae. Um, Mollusks like snails and slugs, there's actually a lot of those, and they tend to be pretty important herbivores, but people don't think about them that much. And if you look real closely here, this is a close-up image, a highly magnified image of a kind of worm called a nematode worm that causes lots of problems for crops. And these knots that you can kind of see if you look real closely on this root are caused by nodules that are made in response to these worms. Farmers spend hundreds of millions of dollars around the world every year to try to control those little worms. They're herbivores. They're pretty important. The biggest group, probably the group that has the biggest impact too, are the insects, here exemplified by this little grasshopper. Now, insects don't seem like they should be real big herbivores, but because their numbers are so high, they have a very large impact on plants throughout the world, on crops, on native plants, on wild plants. In fact, the thought is that the impact that all the insects have is far greater than the impacts of all of those sort of common, well understood large mammal herbivores. So there's a wide variety of diversity of kinds of different herbivores out there. We can start thinking about the diversity of those insect herbivores from a few different perspectives. There's insects that eat on the outside of the plant, and these are the ones that we're maybe a little more familiar with. They chew leaf tissue, right? So we've got a caterpillar that's doing a real good job of mimicking a stick right here. That caterpillar, when it's not hanging out and hiding from birds, is chewing on leaf tissue. Here we've got a picture of a little beetle that has eaten all this leaf tissue away. another beetle adult, grasshoppers. So these are exophages. They eat on the outside of a plant. But then, of course, if there are exo, there's endo. Endophages live on the inside of the plant and typically eat the inside of the plant. We've got a few different things here that exemplify those endophages. This is a gall, a structure that's kind of like a tumor created in the plant by a little fly that as it develops, it makes this tissue be formed by mimicking plant hormones. And then this tissue basically houses and nourishes the little fly that's developing on the inside. So that structure is called a gall, and a galling insect is what can make that plant form that structure. Stem borers do like what their name suggests. This is a stem that's cut in half, and all this black stuff is from the frass or the poop of that little stem borer that has been boring out this tunnel on the inside of that stem, and that could ultimately potentially kill the plant. Clearly, in that case, the insect would act more like a predator than it would a parasite. In the case of the gall, the plant is not going to be killed, so the herbivore acts a little bit more like a parasite than a predator. Another little parasitic type insect is called a leaf miner, and what it's done is the adult has laid an egg, let's say right about here, and as that little insect tunnels in between the outer layers of that leaf tissue, it grows bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then ultimately it gets to a point where it's done developing. It pupates inside the leaf, and then a little while later an adult emerges. When that adult emerges, it makes babies with another adult, and it lays eggs in more leaves, and then they form more tunnels. These tunnels are in the sandwiches inside of a layer of a leaf, so you can imagine these insects are very, very, very small. They're more parasitic than they are predaceous because they don't end up killing the host, the tree. There's another group that arguably could be called an endophage. These are shelter-feeding caterpillars. They take a leaf and then they fold it into what looks like a little burrito, and then they eat the inside of the leaf tissue and that structure that they've just made. So we've got endophagous or endophagous insects, and we've got exophagous insects. We also have groups of insects that feed not on leaf tissue necessarily, but on the liquids that flow within trees or other plants. So here we have some aphids that are feeding on the phloem, or the plant sugars that are the products of photosynthesis of the plant, and they're like little mosquitoes in that they stick their little stylet-like mouth parts into the plant and then they suck these sugary juices out. Spittlebugs do a similar kind of thing in that they suck on plant juices, but they're feeding on xylem instead of phloem. And as they are feeding, they're producing a lot of this spittle, or this frothy mass, which is mostly water. In this particular insect's case, that frothy mass of what looks like spit protects that insect, keeps it from drying out, and also hides it from predators. Adult cicadas typically don't feed, but juvenile cicadas that live underground feed on roots, and they also tap into the xylem tissues of trees underground. Cicadas every few years outbreak in the eastern U.S., and it becomes a very loud and very amazing reminder that there are a lot of underground insects that are also feeding on our plants. Now, one little mouth, one little bite is not going to have a real big impact on a plant, but with lots and lots of mouths, lots and lots of insects add up having a really big impact on wild and on cultivated plants. An estimate of tissue lost to herbivores range from 5%, which is a real small amount, to a third of the terrestrial biomass. So here we've got a picture of a leaf that has been chewed up by a whole bunch of beetles in the tropics. Now, losing 5% of your tissue doesn't seem like it's that big a deal, but when we're talking about a really large tree with hundreds of thousands of leaves, to lose 5% of tissue, it's kind of a little bit of an impact. And if you think about you losing 5% of your tissue to a parasite, you wouldn't be happy about that, right? So still, they're probably going to have some impacts on the fitness of the plant that they're feeding on. Seaweeds and aquatic plants, up to 2/3 of that tissue gets lost by herbivores every year. So herbivores can have a really big fitness negative impact on the plants that they're chewing on. The herbivores get a positive benefit because the tree or the plant tissue is their food. So this is yet another example of these kinds of impacts where there is a positive benefit for one species and a negative effect on the fitness of another species. Again, kind of looking like parasitism or predation if you're keeping track in that table that I suggested a few videos ago. Now, herbivores can have a really big impact not just on the tissue loss, but also on the abundance or the presence of a plant. This is an example of an image taken in the Arctic where geese feed on the plants that are there, and as I said earlier, they can tend to be pretty big impacts as herbivores. They can have a big impact as herbivores. This, what you're looking at, is a picture of something called an exclosure. So it keeps herbivores out, so it keeps the geese out. And you can see that in the areas where they're allowed to feed, it's all brown and all the plants have been consumed by the herbivores. But inside, where the herbivores are kept out, the plants are doing really, really well. So in this particular case, these herbivores are acting like predators out here, and the plants are doing really well when the predators aren't allowed. As I mentioned earlier, there can be below ground herbivores that are very important. This is a larva of a little insect called a ghost moth. There's lots of species of ghost moths, but this is just one. This is a field of kind of plants called lupins that occur out in California. That's clearly a color photo, but this one also is a color photo, and you can tell if you look real closely here, there are some yellow flowers and blue in the background. Well, what's happened in this area, it's the same area as this one here, what's happened in this area is these ghost moths have exploded in their population, and they eat the roots of all of these plants. So these below ground herbivores, again, in this case, are acting a lot like predators. They can kill entire plants just by eating the whole root system away. So herbivores can have a pretty big impact on the abundance and also on the fitness of plants. They can have a really big impact on plant diversity too. Now this is a panel of 5 different figures that involves a lot of information to get to just a few fairly simple points, and then one point that's maybe not so simple. I'm going to spend a bit of time on that, which means that this is something that you should probably understand really well for the future. So let's start off first with understanding what these different players are. Here we have woody plants. These are trees and shrubs, things that have an above ground structure that stays there year after year, and it's tough and it's hard and it's made of wood. Then there are things that are called grasses, and I think you're familiar with grasses. There are grasses and grass-like things. They're all kind of lumped into this one category that in this particular study was just called grasses. So if we go over here, these things are called forbs. So these are herbaceous plants. They don't have woody structures like trees. They're not like grasses, and they make flowers that are kind of like what you would imagine wildflowers are when you consider that term. So these are, you can think of them as wildflowers, but they're in the category of forbs. This group over here, legumes, are a special kind of forb. They really belong over here, but they have something that makes them unique. What makes them unique is that they've got an association between bacteria underground, a mutualism, where those bacteria provide these plants with extra amounts of nitrogen than other plants get. So these plants do really, really well in low nitrogen areas because the bacteria are helping them. And so what that means is the plant tissue of a legume is rich in nitrogen. Now, you've probably heard that it's a good thing to eat legumes. And by legumes we mean peas and beans and things like that. Why are peas and beans really good for you? Because they're high in all sorts of essential amino acids. They give us protein, or the building blocks of protein. So if you're an insect, legumes are a good thing to eat. The plant tissue of legumes is a good thing to eat. Okay, so now we know the players. Let's talk just a little bit about what Mark Ritchie did in the mid to late 90s for this experiment. Essentially what he did, we're going to look down here in this total panel. What he did was he had some plots where he excluded herbivores, and that's this dashed line with the triangles. In some other plots that are the reference plots or control plots, he had a little exclosure built that kept herbivores out, but then he put a bunch of holes in it so that herbivores could actually get access. So those were the reference plots here. And then what he did was he measured the percentage of that area that was covered by plants. Now it's a little weird in that percent cover can go over 100%, but imagine it this way. Let's look at this tree. If we looked at this little piece of ground right here, that piece of ground is 100% covered by grass, right? But if we go straight up, it's also covered by tree. So the percent cover is sort of as you're looking down on that patch of ground, how much vegetation is covering that patch of ground. That could be right on the ground, where grasses and forbs are growing, or it could be covered by the canopy of a tree. And so that's how we can get over 100% cover. So he went out and he looked at the percent cover of all these plots that had no herbivores in them. Herbivores were kept out, they were excluded, versus these plots where herbivores were not allowed. And there's a take-home message of this particular plot. He started this experiment in early 1990s, and then it continued it for several years. And the take-home message here, you can kind of figure it out. When you keep herbivores out, this dashed line, there's more plant material. Sort of a duh answer, right? If you keep herbivores out, there's more plants. Why? Because herbivores are eating those plants. So this result is sort of obvious. You would imagine that this is the outcome. But this is total plant coverage. What if we break it down to different groups? Here's a plot where forbs have no herbivores, and here's where herbivores are allowed. Yep, there's more forbs when you keep herbivores out. What about woody plants? Yeah, there's more woody plant tissue, more woody plant leaves, etc. Greater percent cover of woody plants when you keep herbivores out. That makes sense. Legumes, look at that difference. Really big difference. A lot more legumes when you keep herbivores out than when you allow them in. All these make sense, right? Which ones do they like the most? Well, there's a pretty big increase here. When you allow herbivores in, you've got about maybe 10% or so of percent cover of woody plants, and maybe 30% when you keep herbivores out. That's a big difference. Look at this difference, about 5% to 25% or so. Herbivores really like legumes and woody plants. Why do they like legumes? Remember, they're getting a lot of protein from those. So these three plants make sense. What about this plant group, grasses? When you keep herbivores out, wait, they actually do worse. Grasses like herbivores to be around. One of the things that's interesting about this study is that grasses do better when there are herbivores around. Well, why might that be? If you think about it just a little bit, it's not that the grasses get recruitment. The herbivores don't help them by distributing seeds or anything like that. Grasses actually grow more. They grow better. Why is that? Well, when herbivores are around, they eat the forbs. They eat the legumes. They eat the forbs. They eat the trees. These species are competitors with grasses. Grasses don't get eaten by herbivores. Those grasshoppers and the beetles and deer and things like that, they really don't like the grasses. Why not? Because grass actually has a whole bunch of little silica pellets in it that wears away your teeth if you're an herbivore, and it's kind of low quality food, so it's not really as good for the insects as eating legume tissue or forb tissue or tree tissue. So these are defended. And if the herbivores don't like these but do like these, when you allow herbivores in right here, the grasses do better because their enemies, their competing plants, are getting eaten and they are not. So herbivores can favor different kinds of plants depending on the sorts of defenses that those plants have. In other words, the plant communities can change and can be shifted by the differing preferences that herbivores have. Herbivores can impact plant diversity.